It's
The
all there.
streets
I'll
hum
be in
with the
touch.
rhythm of power, horns blaring, heels clacking, and the faint, ghostly melody of jazz bleeding through the night air. Neon lights flicker against wet pavement as men in dark coats gather under street lamps, their whispered words carrying more weight than any politician's speech. In a world ruled by greed, violence, and opportunity, one name echoes like a warning and a promise: Lucky Luciano. They called him Lucky, not for chance, but for survival. He'd been stabbed, arrested, betrayed, yet always returned stronger, untouchable. His face, sharp and composed, betrayed nothing. His voice calm, calculated, always 2 steps ahead. But beneath the myth was a man who didn't just play the game. He rewrote it. He turned the scattered chaos of immigrant gangs into an empire that operated like a corporation, where every murder, every bribe, every handshake followed an order. He built a government beneath the government. And to do it, he made a secret pact that no lawman could fully uncover, a pact that would make him untouchable for nearly a decade. The story begins in an America teetering between dreams and desperation. The Great Depression had gutted the nation. Prohibition had turned liquor into gold, and corruption flowed through every institution like an underground river. Politicians looked the other way. Police officers took envelopes with trembling hands, and bootleggers became kings. Yet, amidst this chaos, Luciano saw something others didn't: a system waiting to be organized. While most mobsters fought over street corners, Luciano envisioned a syndicate, structured, efficient, and permanent. He saw power not in bullets, but in business. His mind worked like an architect's blueprint. Every deal, every ally, every betrayal meticulously placed to build something larger than himself. But what made him truly dangerous wasn't his ruthlessness. It was his ability to make people believe in the illusion of order. Even his enemies admired his calmness, his ability to turn enemies into partners and violence into strategy. The irony of Lucky Luciano's empire was that it existed both within and outside the law. When prosecutors chased him, they could never quite find him. When rivals plotted against him, they ended up working for him. There was always an invisible shield, connections in high places, debts owed, secrets buried. This wasn't luck. It was leverage. It was the pact he built between power and silence, between crime and respectability. To understand this pact is to step into the mind of a man who mastered control, of people, perception, and fear. Luciano didn't just navigate corruption. He shaped it, refined it, and exported it. He was both the symptom and the cure of America's underworld disorder. His rise wasn't just the story of one gangster. It was the birth of modern organized crime, the transformation of criminality into an industry, and the redefinition of what it meant to be untouchable. Yet every pact comes with a cost. Behind the glamorous veneer of wealth and loyalty lay a trail of blood, betrayal, and psychological warfare. Men who toasted to the commission one night vanished by morning. Women who loved him became pawns in games of power. The same mind that built empires also built walls, emotional ones, moral ones, until even he couldn't see where the man ended and the myth began. This is not a story of luck. It's a story of calculation, of a boy who learned early that the world wasn't fair and decided to rewrite its rules. A story of how charm became a weapon, how loyalty became currency, and how one man's deal with darkness changed the face of crime forever. As the camera pans across the skyline of 1930s Manhattan, the speakeasies glowing, the river shimmering under a full moon, one truth becomes clear: to survive in a world of corruption, you must become its architect. And Lucky Luciano, he didn't just survive. He made a secret pact with America itself. Before Lucky Luciano rose to power, America's criminal underworld was a battlefield, a chaotic jungle of greed, violence, and unspoken vendettas. It was the early 1900s, a time when the city's underbelly was carved up by street gangs, each claiming a few filthy blocks of New York as their own kingdom. The Italians, the Irish, the Jews, each group fought tooth and nail for survival, loyalty measured in spilled blood and broken bones. There was no structure, no vision, no rules beyond fear and retaliation. In these years, the Mafia wasn't the sleek, efficient empire we think of today. It was a collection of fractured clans, old-world traditions colliding with the brutal modernity of American capitalism. Bosses ruled by superstition and rage. Every insult demanded vengeance. Every rumor of betrayal meant another body dumped in the East River. The family wasn't yet a system. It was chaos in 1,000 dialects. Prohibition, meant to save America's soul, did the opposite. When the Volstead Act banned alcohol in 1920, it created a black market so vast that it reshaped the nation's economy. Overnight, liquor became liquid gold. Politicians and police captains found themselves on mob payrolls. Speakeasies flourished under the watch of gangsters, and the average citizen, whether they knew it or not, became a customer of organized crime. But even this booming trade was disorganized. Every gang wanted its share. Every deal ended in gunfire. The city was a chessboard where everyone played checkers. Among the early rulers of this violent world were men like Giuseppe Joe, the Boss, Masuria, and Salvatore Maranzano, names whispered with both respect and fear. They were Sicilians to the core, bound by the old codes of honor from the motherland. They saw America as a territory to conquer, not a home to build. Their vision was medieval. The boss ruled by absolute authority, subordinates obeyed, and dissent meant death. The Mafia, in its raw form, was feudal, a network of petty lords warring for dominance. And under their rule, blood flowed through New York like a second river. The Castellammarese War, which erupted in the late 1920s, was the ultimate symbol of this anarchy. Two rival factions, the Old Guard Sicilians led by Masuria and Maranzano, fought for control of the city's rackets. The war turned the streets into killing fields. Restaurants became ambush zones. Cars exploded without warning. The newspapers called it the Bootlegger War, but it was more than that. It was a struggle for the soul of the American underworld. The immigrant dream had curdled into nightmare. While the old men clung to traditions of secrecy and bloodline, a new generation was watching and learning. Street smart, ambitious, and Americanized, they didn't care about Sicilian hierarchies or rituals. They cared about profit. Among them were young names that would one day define an era: Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Frank Costello, and a sharp-eyed hustler named Charles Lucky Luciano. They grew up in the dirt, but thought like kings. Luciano, still a young lieutenant, studied the chaos with cold fascination. He saw that the old mafia was killing itself, trapped by pride and tribalism. Every war was bad for business. Every feud drained money and power. The idea that gangsters could operate like corporations, with divisions, profits, and diplomacy. This was heresy to the old bosses, but revelation to Luciano. He didn't want to rule by fear. He wanted to govern by logic. He saw America as a land of opportunity, not for honest labor, but for organized power. Meanwhile, the city itself mirrored the corruption of its criminals. Judges took bribes, police captains owned shares in brothels, and city officials looked the other way as long as the cash kept flowing. The line between crime and politics was a blur, and Lucky Luciano was taking notes. He learned that to be truly untouchable, you couldn't just dominate the streets. You had to infiltrate the institutions. You had to make crime respectable. At this time, the Mafia was still divided by bloodlines and dialects. Calabrians, Sicilians, Neapolitans, they distrusted each other more than they did the law. Jewish and Irish gangs were considered outsiders, partners of convenience at best. But Luciano saw what the others didn't. Unity was strength. What if all these factions could operate under one structure? What if the violence could be replaced with organization? That thought, quiet, almost heretical, would become the foundation of modern organized crime. Before Luciano, the underworld was like a storm, loud, destructive, directionless. He would turn it into a machine, smooth and efficient, where money flowed like electricity through hidden circuits of influence. He understood something the old bosses never did. In America, real power doesn't come from bullets. It comes from networks, from deals, from knowing who to shake hands with and who to bury. The chaos of pre-Luciano New York was the crucible that forged him. Every betrayal taught him strategy. Every dead friend taught him patience. Every corrupt official taught him leverage. The disorder was his education, and the streets were his university. By the time the Castellammarese War neared its bloody end, Luciano had already seen the future. He knew that the era of kings and blood feuds was dying, and he would be the man to bury it. Because out of that chaos, a new kind of criminal would rise, not a gangster with a gun, but an executive in the shadows. And his name would define the golden age of organized crime. Salvatore Lucania was born in 1897 in Lercora Fritti, Sicily, a sun-bleached village clinging to the rocky hills of southern Italy. His father was a sulfur miner, a man of hard hands and tired eyes, and his mother a woman of strict faith who believed that poverty was a test from God. But even as a boy, Salvatore felt something burn inside him, a sense that the world's rules didn't apply to him, that power wasn't inherited, it was taken. When his family arrived in New York in 1906, they joined the ocean of immigrants who poured into the slums of the Lower East Side. Their apartment was a single dark room above a bakery, its walls trembling with the sounds of street fights and shouting in half a dozen languages. The air stank of coal smoke and desperation. America, the land of opportunity, looked more like a battlefield of survival. For young Salvatore, school was irrelevant. The real lessons were being taught in the alleys. He learned fast. At just 10 years old, he began running errands for older boys, delivering packages, watching corners, taking cuts from dice games. By 12, he was skipping school entirely, pocketing more in a day than his father made in a week. It wasn't just about money. It was about respect, something the poor never had unless they demanded it. When bullies tried to rob him, he fought back with a ferocity that shocked them. Soon, even the older kids started calling him lucky. Some said it was because he always escaped the police. Others whispered it was because death couldn't seem to touch him. By his teens, Luciano was already connected to the street gangs that ruled downtown. The 5 Points Gang, led by the fearsome Johnny Torrio. Torrio, who would later mentor Al Capone, recognized Luciano's intelligence immediately. Unlike most young thugs, he wasn't reckless. He calculated risk like a businessman. He could charm, deceive, and plan, and that made him dangerous. Under Torrio's guidance, Luciano learned that violence was only useful if it served a purpose. Anyone can pull a trigger, Torrio once told him. The real power is making sure you never have to. During this time, Luciano met two men who would change his life forever, Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. They were young, Jewish, and just as ambitious as he was. While the older generation of gangsters distrusted outsiders, Luciano saw something different, potential partners. Lansky was analytical, a mathematical mind who could make numbers dance. Siegel was volatile, fearless, a man born for danger. Together, they built a bond that defied the tribal rules of the old Mafia, a brotherhood rooted in business, not blood. As Prohibition approached, Luciano's empire began to take shape. He wasn't the biggest player yet, but he was already learning how to build networks of trust that crossed ethnic lines. He partnered with Jewish smugglers, Irish distributors, and Italian enforcers, creating webs of money and influence that confused the police and enriched everyone involved. He also learned the power of image, dressing in sharp suits, speaking with calm authority, never showing emotion. In a city where every gangster screamed for attention, Luciano made silence his weapon. But the streets were cruel teachers. He was arrested several times for theft, gambling, and assault. Each time, he studied the system a little more, how cops could be bought, how lawyers could be swayed, how judges could be compromised. It was a masterclass in corruption, and Luciano was an eager student. Still, there were moments when the mask slipped. He saw friends die over petty disputes, watched families destroyed by greed, and realized that loyalty in the underworld was always temporary. It hardened him, but it also made him smarter. One night in 1929, Luciano's luck almost ran out. After a night of gambling and women, he was kidnapped by rival gangsters, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead on Staten Island. Somehow, he survived, crawling to the road, half conscious, his throat slashed, his body covered in bruises. When the police questioned him, he refused to name his attackers. That silence became part of his legend. From that moment on, he wasn't just lucky because he survived, he was lucky because he didn't fear death. The beating changed him. Physically, his face was never the same. One eye drooped slightly, and scars traced his jawline. But psychologically, something deeper shifted. The boy who'd hustled for street respect became a man who wanted control. He realized that true power didn't come from intimidation. It came from structure. If the streets were chaos, he would be their architect. By the early 1930s, Luciano had positioned himself as a bridge between the old mafia and the modern criminal economy. He worked under Joe Masuria, the self-proclaimed boss of bosses, but he quietly plotted a new vision, an organization that operated like a business, with rules, partnerships, and a board of directors. He had seen enough senseless bloodshed to know that the old ways were unsustainable. America was changing, and the underworld had to evolve with it. What set Luciano apart wasn't just his intelligence, but his psychological detachment. He didn't kill for pleasure or pride. He killed for efficiency. He didn't trust emotion. He trusted systems. He was, in essence, a new kind of gangster, one who thought like an executive, not a warlord. And that made him infinitely more dangerous. The transformation of Salvatore Lucania into Lucky Luciano wasn't a single event. It was a slow metamorphosis shaped by poverty, betrayal, and survival. Every scar was a lesson, every enemy a teacher. He had learned that in America, morality was flexible, but power was absolute. The immigrant kid from Sicily had become something larger than life. The prototype for the modern mob boss, a man who had turned the underworld into an empire. He no longer dreamed of escaping poverty. He dreamed of owning the system that created it. And soon, the streets of New York would belong entirely to him. By the time the smoke of the Castellammare's war began to clear, Lucky Luciano had already evolved into something far more dangerous than a gangster. He was a strategist. He understood that violence might win a street, but organization could win a nation. And at the heart of his transformation stood one man who would shape his destiny, Arnold Rothstein, known throughout New York as the Brain. Rothstein wasn't a killer. He was a businessman. He'd fixed the 1919 World Series, owned nightclubs, racetracks, and politicians. Where others saw crime, Rothstein saw commerce. When Luciano came under his wing, he learned lessons that no street mentor could teach: how to balance a ledger, how to negotiate, and, most importantly, how to make crime look legitimate. Rothstein's office wasn't filled with gunmen. It was filled with ledgers and telephones. Luciano realized that power didn't have to be loud. It could be quiet, elegant, and profitable. Under Rothstein's guidance, Luciano refined his instincts into strategy. He began to treat every racket, bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, as a division in a single company. He delegated responsibilities, kept detailed accounts, and invested in long-term networks instead of short-term scores. Where other mobsters bragged about their crimes, Luciano built infrastructure: warehouses, transport systems, and front businesses that disguised the illegal beneath the illusion of legitimacy. But the true turning point came when Luciano began forming his inner circle, men who shared his modern vision. Meyer Lansky, his cerebral Jewish counterpart, handled finances and strategy. Frank Costello, smooth-talking and politically savvy, worked the corridors of power, bribing officials and building alliances with City Hall. Bugsy Siegel, volatile and fearless, enforced the rules when diplomacy failed. Together, they created something unheard of in the criminal world: an interracial, interethnic partnership built purely on business. This alliance shattered the old mafia mindset. The Sicilian bosses sneered at the idea of working with Jews or Irishmen, but Luciano saw the future. America wasn't Sicily. It was a melting pot, and so too should be its underworld. To him, money had no nationality, and loyalty was defined not by blood but by profit. It was a radical philosophy, and it worked. Luciano's new operation flourished during Prohibition. He controlled liquor shipments through the docks, ran gambling dens protected by police on his payroll, and oversaw brothels that catered to New York's elite. His empire was invisible yet everywhere, each business separate but connected like parts of a single machine. Every dollar that moved fed the next, creating an ecosystem of corruption that was as efficient as it was untouchable. Still, Luciano knew that the greatest threat to his empire wasn't law enforcement. It was chaos from within. The Mafia families were still fractured, ruled by ego-driven bosses like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. Their greed was primitive, their methods outdated. Luciano understood that for organized crime to survive, it had to evolve beyond tradition. He began quietly sowing the seeds of rebellion, convincing younger gangsters that there was a better way. He started holding private meetings in backrooms, cigar smoke curling around whispered words of reform. He spoke not as a soldier, but as a visionary. "This isn't Italy," he would say. "We're businessmen now. There's enough for everyone, if we stop killing each other." Those words carried weight because they promised something new: stability. A world where gangsters could grow old without bullets in their backs. By 1930, Luciano had fully embraced his new identity, a businessman cloaked in criminal skin. His suits were custom-tailored, his demeanor calm, his speech refined. He dined with politicians, bankers, and movie stars. Yet behind the charm was a man who never forgot where he came from. He still walked the streets of the Lower East Side sometimes, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder of what chaos looked like, the chaos he had sworn to control. What set Luciano apart wasn't just his intellect, but his vision of permanence. Every other gangster before him was temporary, a product of a moment destined to die in it. Luciano wanted legacy. He wanted a system that would outlive him, a structure so strong that even if he fell, the machine would keep running. That idea, the notion of a self-sustaining criminal government, would soon take physical form in what the world would come to know as the Commission. By the end of this transformation, the street kid named Salvatore Lucania was gone. In his place stood Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the architect of a new order, blending the ruthlessness of the old world with the intelligence of the new. He was no longer just surviving within the system. He was building his own. It was 1931, and New York City's underworld was drenched in blood. The Castellammare's war had raged for 2 long years, leaving alleys littered with corpses and power scattered like shrapnel. The old guard Sicilian bosses, Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, were locked in a deadly feud for control of the Mafia. Each claimed to be the boss of bosses, the supreme ruler of all Italian crime in America. But to Lucky Luciano, both were dinosaurs, men clinging to outdated traditions that belonged to the old country. Luciano had played both sides with precision. Publicly, he served under Masuria, obeying his commands, running his rackets, and smiling at his arrogance. Privately, he was already building bridges with Maranzano, promising peace and unity if the war could end. He wasn't loyal to either man. He was loyal to the idea of order. Every gunfight was bad for business. Every dead soldier cost money. And while others fought for crowns, Luciano was quietly constructing a system that would make crowns obsolete. The war ended the way most wars in the underworld do, with betrayal. On April 15, 1931, Joe Masuria sat at a Coney Island restaurant playing cards and eating clams. Luciano excused himself to the restroom, leaving Masuria with his bodyguards. Within moments, the doors burst open. Gunmen Vito Genovese, Bugsy Siegel, Albert Anastasia, and Joe Adonis stormed in and opened fire. Masuria slumped over the table, a cigar still smoldering between his fingers. When Luciano returned, the job was done. He picked up Masuria's card hand, studied it, and calmly left. The message was clear. The old world had just been buried. For a brief moment, Maranzano became the undisputed ruler of the Mafia. He crowned himself Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, and declared that all families must pay tribute to him. He reorganized the Mafia into 5 families, each with its own hierarchy of boss, underboss, and consigliere. It was the first step toward order, but Maranzano's arrogance doomed him. He was too proud, too paranoid, and too blind to see that Luciano had already surpassed him in both vision and power. Maranzano believed he could control Luciano's generation, but he underestimated the man he'd just elevated. Luciano saw in Maranzano the same flaws that had doomed Masuria: vanity, old-world suspicion, and the belief that fear alone could sustain loyalty. Within months, Luciano realized that the only way to bring true unity was to eliminate the last tyrant. In September 1931, Luciano struck again. He arranged a meeting with Maranzano at his Manhattan office under the pretense of peace. While Maranzano prepared for the gathering, 4 men entered the building dressed as government agents. They carried briefcases, not Tommy guns. When the secretary ushered them in, the agents pulled revolvers and knives. Within minutes, Salvatore Maranzano, the last of the old Sicilian warlords, was dead on his own carpet. The age of the old Mafia had ended. In its place, Luciano built something entirely new: the Commission. It wasn't a monarchy, it was a board of directors. Each of the 5 families of New York, the Gambino, Lucchese, Genovese, Bonanno, and Colombo families, would control their own territories and interests, but no one would ever again hold absolute power. Disputes would be settled through votes, not bullets. Territories would be divided rationally, and profits shared fairly. Luciano described it as a corporation of criminals, and that's exactly what it became. But the commission wasn't just about the Mafia. Luciano invited other syndicates, Jewish, Irish, even black gangsters, to participate in a national network of organized crime. The Sicilian Code of Isolation was replaced with the American principle of partnership. This wasn't loyalty through blood, it was loyalty through profit. And that philosophy became the true secret pact, an invisible agreement that bound gangsters together across ethnic and geographic lines. Behind closed doors, the commission operated like a shadow government. Members met in hotels, country clubs, and private suites to discuss business strategy, not murder plans. They managed unions, nightclubs, casinos, and shipping companies. They even resolved disputes between Chicago's Al Capone syndicate and New York's 5 families. For the first time in history, organized crime was organized. Luciano's genius was in how he balanced fear and respect. He knew that absolute peace was an illusion, but controlled conflict could be profitable. He allowed smaller disputes to play out, keeping ambitious men busy while maintaining the illusion of unity. He was, in essence, both a CEO and a philosopher, ruling not with emotion, but with calculation. The psychological brilliance of Luciano's pact lay in its duality. On the surface, it was a peace treaty. Beneath it, it was a web of mutual dependence. Every boss owed his position to the system Luciano built. If one man fell, the rest suffered. That interlocking vulnerability became the foundation of his power. No one dared challenge him openly, because doing so would threaten their own fortunes. It wasn't a dictatorship, it was a self-reinforcing illusion of equality that Luciano quietly controlled from the shadows. This was the secret pact, a silent understanding that power was no longer personal, it was structural. It was the moment crime became an institution. For the police, this new world was almost impossible to penetrate. Gone are the obvious gang wars and bloody public shootings. Now, deals were made in private, records were clean, and violence was strategic, not chaotic. Luciano had done what no one before him could. He made organized crime respectable, in form, if not in morality. From that day forward, the Mafia was no longer a collection of criminals. It was an American empire, with Lucky Luciano as its architect and invisible king. Every major racket in the country, from narcotics to construction, flowed through his commission's network. Even politicians and businessmen, knowingly or not, became part of it. Luciano's pact didn't just make him powerful, it made him untouchable. Because when everyone profits from your system, no one wants to destroy it. In the world Lucky Luciano built, survival wasn't just about violence. It was about control. Not the loud kind that left blood in the streets, but the quiet kind that seeped into every room, every handshake, every whispered word of fear. To maintain that kind of power, Luciano understood he needed something deeper than money or muscle. He needed a code, a belief system that could turn criminals into soldiers, partners into loyalists, and fear into obedience. That code was omerta. Omerta wasn't new. It was born in Sicily, in the sunburned hills where silence was survival. It meant absolute loyalty, absolute secrecy. To speak to the police, even in death, was betrayal. To question authority was blasphemy. But in Luciano's America, omerta wasn't just tradition. It was psychological engineering. It turned men into instruments, each convinced that silence was honor and betrayal was sin. Luciano didn't preach omerta like the old bosses did. He weaponized it. He turned an ancient superstition into a modern management tool. Every man in his organization, from capos to street soldiers, lived by the understanding that their worth was measured not by how much they earned, but by how loyal they remained when the world fell apart. It was a culture of fear disguised as family. To Luciano, the Mafia wasn't a gang. It was a system of human control, and omerta was its software. He used loyalty as both currency and chain. Those who stayed silent were rewarded. Money, respect, protection. Those who broke it were erased, not just killed, but unmade. Their names never spoken again, their bodies never found. The message was simple. The moment you betray the family, you stop existing. Yet what made Luciano's rules so effective wasn't just punishment. It was his understanding of human weakness. He didn't demand loyalty through terror alone. He offered it through belonging. Many of the men under him were immigrants or sons of immigrants, poor, discarded, invisible to the world. To them, the Mafia offered identity. Under Luciano, they weren't nobodies. They were part of something bigger, something powerful and eternal. They weren't thugs. They were soldiers of an empire. Luciano would often say, "We're businessmen, not butchers." But beneath that civility, he ruled with the cold precision of a scientist studying human nature. He observed how men craved respect, how pride could make them fearless, and how fear could make them obedient. His calm demeanor disarmed allies and enemies alike. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke softly, people leaned in, and that was how he ruled. Inside this system, fear and loyalty coexisted like two sides of coin. The men who toasted to Luciano at banquets also feared him in private. They loved him because he made them rich. They feared him because he made them irrelevant. To cross him wasn't to invite violence. It was to invite disappearance. One day you were alive, the next you were gone, your rackets absorbed, your existence denied. In the Luciano era, murder became administration. But omerta also served another purpose. It insulated the Mafia from the outside world. The police could arrest individuals, but they could never penetrate the structure. Informants were rare and short-lived. Trials collapsed for lack of testimony. Fear became the organization's greatest defense mechanism. Every silence was a wall. Every secret, a fortress. To betray was to commit suicide. Still, beneath this machinery of control, there was psychology, the subtle manipulation that Luciano perfected. He made his men believe that omerta wasn't just about silence to outsiders. It was about dignity. He reframed fear as honor, turning survival into pride. "We don't talk because we're men," he'd tell them. "The law can't understand what we are." In those words, he gave his soldiers a twisted kind of nobility, the belief that silence made them superior to the corrupt politicians and hypocritical lawmen chasing them. In private, Luciano often compared his organization to the Catholic Church. Both had hierarchy, rituals, confession, punishment. Both demanded faith. But while priests promised salvation in heaven, Luciano promised it in the form of wealth, status, and safety, the earthly trinity that his men truly worshipped. And just like religion, his mafia ran on belief. So long as the men believed in him, in the family, in the sanctity of the code, they were unbreakable. This culture of controlled fear also extended to Luciano's allies. Even outside the Italian syndicates, Jewish, Irish, or others who worked with him knew that betrayal meant annihilation. Deals were sealed not just with money, but with mutual blackmail. Everyone had dirt on everyone else, and that mutual vulnerability became a perverse kind of trust. It was the same principle Luciano had applied to the commission: unity through shared danger. The genius of Luciano's omerta was that it didn't just silence men, it defined them. Breaking it wasn't simply disobedience, it was identity suicide. Men who broke the code didn't just die. They were seen as shameful ghosts, unworthy of remembrance. In a world obsessed with legacy, that was a fate worse than death. But omerta came with a cost, even for Luciano. To maintain his empire, he could never show weakness, never trust fully, never sleep without fear. Every smile could be a mask, every ally a potential Judas. His empire thrived on silence, but silence is lonely. Behind the fine suits and expensive cigars, Luciano lived in a constant state of tension, surrounded by men who loved him, feared him, and waited for his fall. What Luciano built was more than an organization. It was a psychological fortress. Its foundation was secrecy, its pillars were loyalty and fear, and its crown was profit. Under his rule, the Mafia evolved from a loose fraternity of thugs into a disciplined syndicate, a brotherhood with its own moral code, language, and governance. It was the Underworld's version of civilization. And in this dark civilization, omerta wasn't just law, it was faith. A faith enforced by bullets, maintained by silence, and worshipped by men who believed that in loyalty, they'd found immortality. By the mid-1930s, lucky Luciano stood at the pinnacle of power. The war was over. The commission was in place. The Mafia was no longer a patchwork of rival gangs. It was an empire, sleek and efficient, built on profit instead of pride. For the first time in American history, organized crime had structure. And at its center stood Luciano, calm, sharp, and untouchable. Yet, even as the system he built thrived, the empire he ruled began to show its cracks. Power attracts ambition, and ambition breeds enemies. Luciano's world was filled with both. On one side stood his closest allies, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Bugsy Siegel, and Joe Adonis, men who had risen from the same streets and shared his vision of modern crime. Together, they formed the inner circle that kept the machinery of the Mafia running. But among allies, there's always calculation. Each man was a genius in his domain. Lansky with numbers, Costello with politics, Genovese with fear, and each dreamed of being more than just a lieutenant. Luciano's partnership with Meyer Lansky was the most enduring and profound. Lansky was not just his bookkeeper. He was his intellectual equal. Together, they transformed vice into industry, establishing a criminal economy that reached from New York to Havana. Lansky handled the accounting, laundering money through offshore investments, casinos, and legitimate enterprises. To him, crime was mathematics. To Luciano, it was psychology. Together, they were the twin architects of organized crime's golden age, brain and instinct fused into empire. Frank Costello, meanwhile, was the politician, the man who made the streets and city hall shake hands. He bribed judges, owned police captains, and influenced elections. While Luciano controlled the underworld, Costello controlled the overworld, the realm of politicians, unions, and businessmen. To the public, he was charming and respectable, a man of cigars and tailored suits, always just far enough in the dirt to stay clean. But no alliance lasts forever. Vito Genovese, Luciano's old friend and one-time protege, simmered with envy. He was everything Luciano wasn't: loud, violent, and impulsive. Where Luciano built bridges, Genovese burned them. He saw diplomacy as weakness and bloodshed as purity. To him, the modernized Mafia was too soft, too Americanized. Behind Luciano's back, he whispered that the boss had grown arrogant, that he'd forgotten what it meant to be Sicilian. Still, Luciano understood that even enemies could be useful. He allowed Genovese to keep his ambitions close, believing he could control him through flattery and money. But in the shadows, Genovese was already plotting, waiting for the day the king would stumble. Meanwhile, Bugsy Siegel, Luciano's volatile partner and childhood friend, was expanding their reach westward. He brought the Mafia to Hollywood, rubbing shoulders with actors, directors, and studio heads. His charisma opened doors money couldn't. But Siegel's temper and recklessness worried Luciano. "Bugsy's like fire," he once told Lansky. "You can cook with it, or it can burn your house down." Still, Siegel's boldness gave birth to a new frontier, Las Vegas. The desert would one day bloom with neon under the criminal vision Luciano had inspired. Under this network of allies and competitors, the business of crime became astonishingly sophisticated. Luciano's organization controlled bootlegging routes, narcotics trade, illegal gambling dens, prostitution rings, and labor unions. Dock workers, truck drivers, and city officials were all part of the web, knowingly or not. The Mafia didn't just exploit the system, it became part of it. Even construction companies and film studios had invisible ties to Luciano's network. But success brought scrutiny. Newspapers began calling Luciano the king of the underworld. Detectives whispered his name in every precinct. Politicians, embarrassed by their own complicity, began to seek a scapegoat. And that scapegoat was Lucky Luciano. The man who had united the Mafia now faced enemies from both sides, within and without. On the inside, jealousy brewed. Men like Genovese resented that Luciano was treating gangsters like businessmen, stripping away the bloody glory that once defined them. On the outside, a new kind of enemy emerged, reformers. Men who saw Luciano's order not as progress, but as corruption infecting America's soul. At the forefront of this moral crusade was Thomas E. Dewey, a sharp, relentless prosecutor rising through New York's justice system. Dewey was the mirror opposite of Luciano, clean-cut, ambitious, and incorruptible. He saw Luciano's empire as a personal challenge, a symbol of everything wrong with America's institutions. His speeches promised to clean the city of parasites. His words had the rhythm of war. The first cracks in Luciano's armor came not from bootlegging or gambling, but from vice. The police began investigating the prostitution racket that stretched across New York, allegedly under Luciano's control. Hundreds of women worked in brothels that paid silent tribute to the Mafia. Dewey seized on this, framing it not as organized crime, but as moral decay. He would use America's morality to destroy its most immoral king. As raids began and arrests mounted, Luciano's world trembled. He had built his empire on silence, but the women running his brothels had no such code. They began to talk. Names, places, dates. Dewey's office was flooded with testimony. For the first time, Luciano couldn't hide behind the shadows. The press was watching, and the courts were hungry for a trophy. Inside the commission, loyalty wavered. Some whispered that Luciano had brought too much attention, that his fame was becoming a liability. Others, secretly aligned with Genovese, began imagining a world without him. Luciano sensed it, but by then, the machinery he built had grown too vast to control completely. The empire that once made him untouchable was slowly turning into a cage. Still, in the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano's reign was at its most dazzling. He lived in luxury hotels, surrounded by chorus girls and politicians, his name whispered with awe and fear. To the world, he was invincible, a man who owned both the streets and the skyline. Yet behind the tailored suits and calm smile, he knew something the others didn't. No empire stays clean forever. For every alliance, there is an enemy in disguise. For every handshake, a hidden blade. And as the balance of power began to shift, Luciano's greatest strength, his ability to build unity, would soon become the weapon that tore his kingdom apart. The mid-1930s were supposed to be Luciano's age of peace. The commission had brought order, profits were steady, and the gang wars that once painted New York red had all but vanished. But beneath that polished surface, a hidden war was brewing, one that couldn't be fought with Tommy guns or street ambushes. This was a war of intelligence, surveillance, and political will. The enemy wasn't another mob family this time. It was the American justice system itself, led by one man who refused to be bought, Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey was young, sharp, and ruthless in his own right. At 32, he was already making a name for himself as the prosecutor who could take down anyone: bootleggers, corrupt politicians, racketeers. He dressed as sharply as Luciano, spoke with precision, and possessed the kind of moral arrogance that made him both admirable and dangerous. To him, the Mafia was not a myth. It was a disease eating the heart of New York. And Lucky Luciano, he declared, was the infection's source. Luciano, meanwhile, saw Dewey as an inconvenience, another ambitious lawyer looking for headlines. For years, he had bought off judges and police chiefs, ensuring investigations died before they started. He assumed Dewey would be no different. But Dewey didn't want bribes. He wanted a legacy. He wanted to be the man who proved that even the untouchables could bleed. The first shots of this war were fired in whispers. Dewey's agents began quietly shadowing Luciano's operations, not his drug trade or gambling halls, but something far more vulnerable: the vice rackets. The prostitution networks that had long operated under Luciano's protection became the prosecutor's entry point. They were messy, emotional, and filled with talkative people. For years, Luciano's lieutenants had taxed and protected hundreds of brothels across the city, taking a cut of every dollar made. It was a business built on human weakness, and it would soon become his greatest liability. Dewey's team infiltrated these brothels through informants, often turning madams and prostitutes against their handlers. At first, the idea of testifying against the Mafia seemed suicidal. But Dewey offered protection, anonymity, even financial help. One by one, frightened women began to talk. Names surfaced, routes of payment, code phrases. Eventually, the name at the top of every ledger was the same: Charles Lucky Luciano. The press devoured it. Headlines screamed of Vice King Luciano, of thousands of women forced into servitude under his empire. The moral outrage was electrifying. Newspapers painted Luciano as the devil behind America's corruption, the man who defiled not just laws, but decency itself. In truth, his direct involvement was minimal. Luciano rarely managed brothels personally. His lieutenants handled those operations. But perception, he knew, could be deadlier than fact. As Dewey's case grew, Luciano realized that his old strategy, control through silence, might not work this time. Fear could silence men, but not frightened women who'd been promised freedom and fame by the state. The same system he had infiltrated through bribes and alliances was now turning on him, fortified by moral fury. Worse, he began to sense cracks within the commission. His allies, once united, were growing distant. Vito Genovese whispered that Luciano's notoriety was bad for business. Frank Costello began focusing more on politics than defense. Even Lansky, loyal as ever, knew this battle couldn't be fought the old way. The hidden war deepened when Dewey went public. He began holding press conferences detailing the Luciano Vice Syndicate, making the gangster's name a daily fixture in households across America. For every accusation, Luciano responded with calm denial. "They can't prove what doesn't exist," he said, his usual smirk hiding the quiet tension building beneath. He moved from hotel to hotel, always surrounded by bodyguards and lawyers, always pretending control. But Dewey wasn't after immediate arrest. He was tightening the noose. Over months, he built a network of witnesses, gathering testimony that connected Luciano to the prostitution business through middlemen and coded ledgers. Each step brought prosecutors closer to the center of the web. Luciano's greatest weapon, invisibility, was being stripped away, piece by piece, until even his allies began to doubt the legend of the untouchable man. For the first time in his life, Luciano found himself reacting instead of controlling. His empire was too large to disappear, too visible to deny. Every dollar, every connection, every favor he'd built was suddenly evidence against him. And while he still controlled much of the city through bribery and intimidation, Dewey had something even stronger: public opinion. The people wanted a villain to blame for their moral decay, and Luciano's name fit perfectly. The final months of the investigation turned New York into a stage. Dewey played the crusading knight, Luciano, the charming devil. In nightclubs and courtrooms, in newspapers and gossip columns, the two men waged psychological warfare. Luciano projected confidence, dining at the Waldorf, tipping reporters, even joking with detectives. But behind that mask, he knew that this wasn't a war he could win with money. The old ways, fear, silence, bribery, were becoming obsolete. The hidden war wasn't just between Dewey and Luciano. It was between two versions of America. One was the America of corruption, the smoky backrooms where deals were made and rules bent. The other was the America of reform, law, order, and public morality. Luciano had built his empire in the first America, but now the second was rising to destroy him. In 1936, the war finally erupted into the open. Dewey's men arrested dozens of Luciano's associates, raiding brothels and offices. Evidence poured in, and for the first time, Luciano's name appeared not as rumor, but as charge. The newspapers declared victory before the trial even began. The untouchable man had finally been touched. Yet even as the walls closed in, Luciano didn't panic. To his last breath as a free man, he remained the embodiment of composure. "Let them come," he told his men. "They can't jail an idea. But even ideas can bleed when the world decides to change." And as Dewey sharpened his knives for the courtroom, the empire that once ruled the shadows was about to face the full light of justice. The spring of 1936 arrived like a storm, and for lucky Luciano, it carried the sound of boots, sirens, and betrayal. For years, he had moved like smoke through the cracks of the law, untouchable, invisible, always one step ahead. But now the system had finally caught his scent. Thomas E. Dewey, relentless and righteous, had tightened the noose around the king of organized crime. The newspapers were screaming for blood, and for the first time in his empire's glittering reign, Luciano's luck began to turn. On the morning of April 2nd, 1936, detectives raided the Waldorf Towers, Luciano's luxurious suite where he often held discreet meetings with associates and politicians alike. The search was symbolic. There was no real evidence to be found there, but the humiliation was the point. Hours later, they caught him hiding in Hot Springs, Arkansas, far from the chaos of New York. He was arrested in a bathrobe, surrounded by bodyguards who surrendered without a fight. To the press, it was a spectacle. The mighty kingpin dragged back to New York in handcuffs. For the first time, Luciano's photograph appeared not as a figure of fascination, but as the face of sin. The man who once controlled New York's underworld was now paraded through the courthouse, his slick hair disheveled, his expression cold but calm. He knew this was more than a legal case. It was a public execution of reputation. Dewey wasn't just after a conviction. He wanted a legend destroyed. The prosecution built its case meticulously. Over 200 witnesses were lined up, many of them women from Luciano's own prostitution network. One by one, they painted a picture of an invisible empire, an organization that spanned hundreds of brothels, all funneling money up the chain to Luciano. Some accounts were exaggerated, others outright false, but the pattern was convincing. Luciano didn't need to be physically present to be guilty. He only needed to have built the system that profited from their work. And that, Dewey argued, was exactly what he'd done. The betrayal that stung most came from inside. Several of Luciano's trusted lieutenants, men who had once toasted to his name and kissed his ring, turned informants under pressure. Ciro Terranova, Charles Lagaipa, and others provided details of the vice taxes, the payments brothels made to the Luciano family for protection. Whether from fear, greed, or a promise of leniency, they broke omerta, the sacred code of silence Luciano had spent years enforcing. To him, This was worse than prison. It was personal treason. In his private moments, the mask sometimes slipped. He told a close associate, "I can handle Dewey, but I can't handle rats." He knew betrayal was part of the business, but to see his empire unravel from within, not by bullets, but by words, cut deeper than any wound he'd ever suffered. The trial that followed was nothing short of theater. Dewey entered the courtroom like a general leading a crusade, his evidence stacked high, his witnesses rehearsed for drama. The newspapers called it the trial of the century. Cameras flashed as Luciano was escorted in every morning, his face expressionless, his suit immaculate. He refused to show fear, not for the judge, not for Dewey, not for anyone. If he was going to fall, he would fall as a king. Inside the courtroom, Dewey's voice thundered through the proceedings, painting Luciano as the spider at the center of a vast criminal web. The witnesses cried, the jurors listened wide-eyed, and the audience gasped at every revelation. But Luciano didn't flinch. He sat still, smoking, studying every word, every gesture. He had always known that power required theater, and now, he was the centerpiece of someone else's stage. His defense attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that Luciano had been framed by ambitious prosecutors and frightened women seeking protection. But the tide of public opinion was unstoppable. The Great Depression had hardened people's sense of morality, and the idea of a rich gangster exploiting the poor struck a nerve. Luciano became the symbol of everything corrupt, the criminal aristocracy living off America's suffering. As the trial dragged on, Luciano's allies outside the courtroom scrambled to protect what was left of the empire. Lansky and Costello tried to stabilize the rackets, ensuring money still flowed to the right hands. Genovese, ever the opportunist, presented himself as loyal, but secretly began preparing to claim control in the event of Luciano's downfall. The commission held emergency meetings in smoky backrooms, discussing how to preserve balance if their leader was convicted. Luciano's empire would survive, they agreed, but his throne might not. On June 6, 1936, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The courtroom erupted. Dewey's expression remained stern but triumphant. Luciano's face, however, didn't move. He simply leaned back, exhaled slowly, and nodded once, the gesture of a man acknowledging fate. When the judge pronounced a sentence of 30 to 50 years, the longest ever given for such crimes, the world seemed to stop. Reporters rushed to telephones. Headlines screamed, "Lucky Luciano finally falls." Dewey was hailed as a hero, his political career catapulted overnight. Luciano was led from the courtroom in silence. No defiance, no curses, just a faint, unreadable smile. When a reporter shouted, "Any last words?" Lucky, he paused, turned his head slightly, and said, "There's no last word until I say it." Those words would linger in the air long after the doors closed behind him. That night, as he was processed into Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, the cold walls of the prison loomed like tombstones. Yet even here, surrounded by concrete and steel, Luciano's mind was working. Power, he understood, wasn't about presence. It was about perception. They could lock his body, but not the idea of Lucky Luciano. His empire was too vast, his influence too deeply rooted in men's greed and fear. Still, the pain of betrayal followed him. The empire he built on silence had crumbled because of voices, the very thing he'd tried to control. His secret pact, the invisible shield of loyalty and code, had finally broken. Not because of Dewey, not because of law, but because of human weakness. The man who had mastered every rule of power was learning its cruelest truth. Every empire, no matter how disciplined, is only as strong as the silence it commands. The courtroom in Albany, New York, was packed to the walls the day Lucky Luciano's trial began in earnest. Reporters jostled for seats, photographers hovered by the doorways, and spectators craned their necks for a glimpse of the man who had ruled the underworld like a monarch. The air felt charged, a mix of perfume, sweat, and anticipation. Everyone wanted to see if the myth of the untouchable gangster would finally shatter under the weight of law and public morality. This wasn't just a criminal proceeding. It was a spectacle, a morality play for a nation obsessed with redemption after years of corruption and chaos. The Great Depression had left Americans yearning for heroes and villains, and in Thomas E. Dewey, the young, iron-willed prosecutor, they found both the avenger and the prophet. To the newspapers, Dewey was a clean-cut knight slaying the dragon of vice. To Luciano, he was a zealot with a typewriter and a microphone. Every morning, Luciano entered the courtroom in tailored suits that fit him like armor. He was punctual, calm, and eerily composed, a businessman attending a meeting, not a man on trial for his empire. His coolness fascinated the press. "Luciano looks like he's chairing a board meeting," one reporter wrote, "not standing trial for corruption." He knew appearances mattered. Even when his empire was collapsing, he refused to let them see him bleed. Dewey, on the other hand, was relentless. He stood before the jury like a preacher, painting Luciano not just as a criminal, but as a moral contagion. He didn't accuse him of theft or violence. He accused him of poisoning America's soul. "This man," Dewey declared, "is not content with breaking the law. He profits from breaking human beings." The words struck like bullets. Each sentence was rehearsed, each pause theatrical. Dewey wasn't just prosecuting Luciano. He was rewriting the story of good and evil for the entire country. The witnesses became his chorus. Dewey paraded dozens of women before the court, madams, prostitutes, and clerks, their stories vivid and heartbreaking. They spoke of payments, coded messages, and whispered orders that linked every brothel in New York back to Luciano's network. Some were trembling, others defiant. Many had been coached by the prosecution, but it didn't matter. The narrative was irresistible, a powerful man exploiting the powerless. Luciano's defense countered with quiet precision. His lawyer, Moses Polikoff, argued that there was no direct evidence, no signed orders, no paper trail. The accused, he said, was being crucified for reputation, not proof. Mr. Luciano, Polikoff told the jury, is a man of influence, not a man of vice. If guilt can be proven by association, then we are all guilty of something. His voice was calm, but drowned beneath the thunder of Dewey's moral crusade. What made the trial so devastating wasn't the evidence. It was the narrative. Dewey understood that juries didn't convict facts. They convicted symbols. To the public, Luciano wasn't one man. He was every corrupt official, every bootlegger, every shadowy figure who had made America cynical. The courtroom became a confessional for the nation's sins, and Luciano played the part of the devil with grace. Behind closed doors, he felt the walls closing in. Witnesses he had counted on to stay silent were flipping one by one. Police captains who once took his money were now testifying against him under oath. The code of omerta, which had protected him for so long, was cracking under the promise of leniency and protection. Even men within his own circle had gone quiet, afraid that any contact with him would bring the law down on their heads. The trial dragged on for weeks, and with each passing day, the spectacle grew. Outside the courthouse, protesters demanded justice while others sold newspapers and souvenirs with Luciano's face on them. America was watching and judging. For every woman who testified, for every revelation about vice and corruption, the crowd outside cheered. The public had chosen their villain. Luciano remained defiant. In private, he told a journalist, "If they want a monster, I'll give them one." But that bravado masked a slow-burning rage. He wasn't angry at Dewey. He admired the man's intelligence. What infuriated him was betrayal, the realization that power meant nothing without loyalty. He had built an empire on human psychology, but in the end, it was human weakness that destroyed it. When the verdict was finally read, guilty on 62 counts, the room fell into a stunned silence. Then, like thunder, applause broke out. People wept, clapped, shouted. Dewey stood still, stone-faced, as if aware he had just become a national hero. Luciano didn't move. He simply lit a cigarette, inhaled, and smiled faintly. That smile, calm, cold, unreadable, made the front page of every newspaper in America the next morning. The sentencing came swiftly, 30 to 50 years in state prison. It was a death sentence in all but name. Dewey had won not only a legal victory, but a symbolic one, proof that no man, however powerful, could escape justice. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions as Luciano was escorted to the waiting car. When asked if he had any regrets, he paused, turned slightly, and said, "Only that I didn't charge more." That single line cemented his legend, half arrogance, half truth. Yet beneath the bravado, there was an unspoken recognition that this was the end of an era. The Mafia had been dragged into daylight, and the myth of the honorable gangster had been replaced by the image of a criminal empire run like a corporation. Luciano's dream of structure and unity had succeeded, but it had also made him visible, traceable, and vulnerable. As the car drove him north to Clinton Correctional Facility, the press followed in convoys, snapping photos of the fallen king. Dewey, meanwhile, was celebrated as the savior of New York, his political future assured. Two men, mirror images of ambition, had faced off, and morality had won, at least for now. But inside the prison walls, Lucky Luciano was already thinking differently. He had lost his freedom, but not his influence. The system he created was still running, and it would keep running without him. He had built something too vast to destroy with a verdict. The trial was over, but the story wasn't. Because for men like Lucky Luciano, the end of one war is only the beginning of another. Prison was supposed to be the end of Lucky Luciano, a lifetime buried behind concrete walls and iron bars. Yet, in a strange way, it only proved how deep his reach really was. When he arrived at Clinton Correctional Facility in upstate New York, the guards expected to see a broken man. Instead, they met someone calm, polite, and disturbingly composed. Luciano didn't pace or curse. He adjusted his tie, nodded to the warden, and walked in as if he were checking into another hotel. From the outside, he was inmate number 92168, sentenced to 30 to 50 years for compulsory prostitution. But behind those walls, he remained Lucky Luciano, the architect of the Mafia, and he was about to turn prison into another branch of his empire. Within weeks, Luciano began to reorganize his world from behind bars. He had connections to guards, wardens, and politicians, all men who owed him favors or feared his influence. Money flowed from the outside in the form of bribes and gifts, ensuring that his life in prison was nothing like that of an ordinary inmate. He had better clothes, better food, and even limited access to news and correspondence. To the average prisoner, the system was oppressive. To Luciano, it was negotiable. But control wasn't just about comfort. It was about communication. Luciano used coded letters, smuggled messages, and trusted intermediaries to stay in touch with his lieutenants on the outside. Each note carried instructions for the 5 families: maintain the commission, avoid unnecessary bloodshed, and never use his imprisonment as an excuse to lose order. His influence continued to shape the Mafia's operations in New York, Chicago, and beyond. Even from his cell, he remained the silent chairman of organized crime. To keep the organization stable, Luciano relied heavily on Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky. Costello handled the political side, greasing palms and keeping the government's attention elsewhere, while Lansky oversaw finances, ensuring Luciano's money continued to circulate through offshore accounts and legitimate fronts. They became his eyes and hands, maintaining the machine he had built. And though they publicly distanced themselves from him, every major decision in the underworld still carried his invisible signature. Luciano's adaptability inside prison revealed his true genius. He understood that power was never about location, but perception. If people believed he was still in charge, he was. Guards whispered stories about how even the prison hierarchy revolved around him. Inmates deferred to him for advice, protection, or connections. When fights broke out, he could stop them with a look. He never raised his voice, never made threats, but everyone knew. Even in here, Lucky ran things. Still, there were moments when the facade cracked. The silence of prison life, the monotonous days, the whispers of betrayal, they all took their toll. The man who once dined at the Waldorf Astoria now stared through iron bars at the snow falling outside his narrow window. The world was changing without him. The bootlegging era had ended, new faces were rising in the streets, and law enforcement had become more sophisticated. Even the commission, though loyal, began to evolve in directions he couldn't always control. Luciano wasn't one to indulge in self-pity, but isolation forced reflection. He began to think about legacy, not in terms of morality, but permanence. Would his empire survive without him? Would his name become myth or memory? In rare conversations with trusted guards, he would joke, "Maybe Dewey did me a favor. Out there, everyone's dying to live. In here, I've got all the time in the world." Beneath the humor was truth. Prison had slowed him, but it hadn't erased him. Despite his physical confinement, Luciano's legend only grew larger. Newspapers occasionally ran stories about how he still ruled from behind bars. Reporters speculated that even prison officials answered to him. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. Perception was power, and Lucky understood that perfectly. The myth of his control kept rivals cautious and allies obedient. He had created a new kind of authority, mythological leadership. Still, the outside world wasn't idle. Law enforcement continued to dismantle his network, and reformists pushed to purge corruption from city institutions. Luciano watched all of it unfold through smuggled newspapers and coded letters. He admired Dewey's success. The man who had beaten him was now a national figure, a potential presidential candidate. Ironically, Luciano saw a reflection of himself in Dewey. Ruthless, ambitious, strategic. "We're the same kind of animal," he once told a fellow inmate. "We just wear different suits." Then came World War II, and with it, a new kind of opportunity. As German U-boats began attacking ships along the American coastline, rumors spread that the Mafia still controlled the docks and that Luciano's men could help the Navy secure them. It was a story too convenient to ignore. Suddenly, the man the government had condemned as a menace might become its ally. In 1942, whispers reached Luciano's cell that naval intelligence wanted to talk. The same system that had locked him away was now knocking on his door. What began as cautious curiosity would soon become the most improbable chapter of his life, a secret alliance between the United States government and its most infamous prisoner. But before that deal would be made, Luciano had already achieved something remarkable. He had proven that power could survive isolation, that even behind bars, a man who understood loyalty and fear could remain king. His body was imprisoned, but his mind and his influence roamed freely across the underworld. For the first time in American history, a prisoner had become more powerful inside the walls than he had been outside them. And for Lucky Luciano, that was victory enough for now. Freedom had never felt so fragile. When Lucky Luciano stepped off the ship in Naples in 1946, he was greeted not as a criminal, but as a legend. Crowds gathered at the docks to glimpse the man who had built an empire across the ocean, the king of the American underworld, the boss who had outsmarted the law and even struck a deal with the U.S. Navy. For the Italians, he was part myth, part symbol, the Sicilian son who had conquered America. But beneath the applause and the flash of cameras, Luciano knew the truth. Exile was just another kind of prison. Italy was a different world. The country was broken from the war, its economy shattered, its politics fractured between fascist remnants and new democratic factions. Poverty and black markets thrived, and corruption was currency. It should have been Luciano's perfect environment, but he quickly realized that he no longer fit in. He was too American, too modern, too public. The Sicilian dons respected him, but didn't trust him. They saw him as the man who had betrayed the old code by turning the Mafia into a business. Still, Luciano couldn't resist the pull of influence. He began to reconnect with contacts in Palermo, Rome, and Naples, quietly establishing networks that would soon form part of the global narcotics trade. Heroin moved through the Mediterranean like contraband gold, and Luciano, ever the strategist, helped organize the logistics. He set up shipping routes, front companies, and international connections linking Europe to the United States through trusted intermediaries. Though he denied his involvement, intelligence reports from both Italy and the U.S. described him as the shadow figure behind a new empire, one more elusive than ever. For the American authorities, Luciano's freedom had become an embarrassment. The man they had deported as a relic of the past was once again a symbol of organized power. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, led by Harry Anslinger, began building a case against him, arguing that he had turned Italy into the command center for the international drug trade. Surveillance intensified. Phone lines were tapped. Associates followed. But Luciano was careful. He never signed documents, never spoke directly of business. Like a ghost, he operated through whispers and gestures. Despite his continued influence, there was a growing emptiness inside him. The faces around him changed. Younger men who admired his legend but didn't understand his principles. They were reckless, greedy, obsessed with violence, traits he had spent his life trying to control. The order and discipline he had built in America had dissolved into chaos without him. The commission still existed, but new names, Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, now shaped its direction. Luciano had become a spectator to his own legacy. Loneliness began to weigh on him. He lived in a luxurious apartment in Naples, surrounded by expensive furniture and servants, but the silence was suffocating. He kept a photograph of Manhattan on his desk, the skyline of the city that had made him immortal and damned him in the same breath. Visitors often found him listening to American radio broadcasts, smiling faintly when he heard jazz or baseball commentary. "I left my heart in New York," he once said, "and they won't even let me visit the grave." In 1947, he tried to re-enter Cuba, hoping to rebuild his influence closer to American shores. With Lansky's help, he arrived in Havana under a false name and began meeting with old allies in the city's glamorous casinos. For a brief moment, it seemed like the empire could rise again. But the U.S. government discovered his presence and pressured Cuba to expel him. Within weeks, Luciano was deported back to Italy, humiliated and bitter. It was the last time he would ever see the Western Hemisphere. The following years were quieter but not peaceful. He remained under near-constant surveillance, his phone tapped, his mail intercepted. To the world, he was retired. To himself, he was merely waiting. He entertained journalists and filmmakers, offering selective memories of his past, shaping his own mythology. "I never wanted to be a gangster," he told one reporter. "I just wanted to live like a man who didn't take orders." In truth, the man who had once controlled an empire now lived surrounded by ghosts, the ghosts of ambition, betrayal, and time. He had beaten death, prison, and disgrace, but he couldn't beat irrelevance. His last years were spent in quiet reflection, watching from afar as the empire he built transformed into something even he could no longer recognize. The exile had become the observer, the ruler turned relic. But even in the twilight of his life, one fact remained undeniable. The world Luciano built still existed. It was just wearing a different suit. By the time Lucky Luciano reached his final years in the late 1950s, he was no longer the man who had once ruled New York from smoke-filled backrooms and whispered phone calls. His hair had thinned, his back had bent slightly, and his once razor-sharp voice had softened into something almost reflective. But even in exile, there was still an aura about him, a presence that silenced rooms. In Naples, people still nodded when he passed, as if acknowledging an emperor in disguise. He was the last remnant of an era when crime was organized, calculated, and strangely honorable. Yet behind the calm exterior, Luciano was haunted by the same question that stalks every man who builds an empire. What did it all mean? In 1959, he was living quietly in a small villa overlooking the Bay of Naples. The sea stretched endlessly before him, beautiful, calm, and cold. He often spent mornings on the terrace, reading newspapers from New York that Meyer Lansky had arranged to have delivered weekly. Each headline about the Mafia, new arrests, new power struggles, new names, reminded him that his creation had outgrown him. The five families were still in power, The commission still met in secret, and the Mafia had expanded far beyond his original design. Yet it had also lost the discipline he'd built it on. Violence had replaced strategy. Greed had replaced order. The machine was still running, but without its architect. Sometimes he would mutter to himself, "They forgot the rules." He meant it literally. For Luciano, crime had always been a system, efficient, logical, almost industrial. Now it had become theater again, driven by young men who mistook chaos for courage. He saw it in the new generation. Men like Carlo Gambino and Joseph Bonanno, ambitious but reckless. They had inherited his structure, but not his restraint. He couldn't decide whether to feel proud or disgusted. Luciano's exile had become a study in contrast, adored by the underworld, despised by the law, forgotten by the public. He was neither saint nor villain, just a man left alone with the consequences of his genius. When visitors came, he spoke of the past, not with nostalgia, but with irony. "You know what the secret was?" he once told a journalist. "It wasn't about crime. It was about control. The others wanted power, I wanted peace. Power never lasts. Control does. But even control has limits." In January 1962, Luciano agreed to meet with an American film producer who wanted to make a movie about his life, a final attempt to shape his story on his own terms. He arrived at Naples' Capodichino Airport in a gray overcoat, immaculately dressed as always, his hair slicked back, his posture erect despite the years. Witnesses say he greeted the producer warmly, extended his hand, and then, without warning, collapsed. A massive heart attack struck him mid-sentence. By the time the ambulance arrived, the man who had once ruled America's underworld was gone. The newspapers called it an unceremonious end for a ceremonious man. There were no grand funerals, no mafia pageantry. His body was eventually transported to New York, the city that had made him immortal, and buried at St. John's Cemetery in Queens, not far from the graves of many who had served or betrayed him. The ceremony was small, but hundreds of people came quietly over the next few weeks, leaving flowers and folded notes. Some were old associates, others were simply admirers of the myth. In death, Luciano achieved what he had always sought in life: permanence. His name became legend, his methods blueprint. Historians called him the father of modern organized crime. The FBI called him the most significant criminal of the 20th century. Hollywood called him something else, a tragic genius. Each version told part of the truth. The legacy he left behind was not just criminal, it was psychological. Luciano had shown that power wasn't about chaos, but systems, that even in darkness, order could exist. He proved that loyalty could be engineered, fear could be managed, and crime could wear the mask of respectability. His structure, the commission, still functioned decades later, its influence stretching from New York to Sicily, from casinos in Havana to construction firms in Chicago. Governments rose and fell, laws changed, but Luciano's model endured. And yet, the irony of his legacy was inescapable. The code of unity he built eventually became the seed of new betrayals. The very commission that had ended mafia wars would one day sanction murders as casually as business transactions. The corporate efficiency Luciano introduced made the mafia richer, but also colder, more inhuman. His vision of balance had become an empire of greed. He had turned gangsters into businessmen, but in doing so, stripped them of their soul. For all his brilliance, lucky Luciano died with the same truth that all men of power eventually face. You can build a system, but you can't control what it becomes. His secret pact had worked for decades, but no deal lasts forever. Time changes everything, even the meaning of loyalty. Today, historians still debate whether he was a criminal genius or simply a pragmatist shaped by his time. To some, he was a villain who corrupted entire generations. To others, a visionary who imposed order on chaos. But perhaps Luciano himself would have dismissed both views. He once said, "Everybody's got a racket. Mine just happened to be crime." Standing at his grave, one might imagine his faint smile, the same calm, knowing expression that never left his face. He had beaten bullets, betrayed death, and even made peace with the government. In a world built on fear and silence, he had found a way to be remembered not as a monster, but as a myth. The streets he once ruled have changed, but the echo of his name remains, whispered, studied, imitated. Because Lucky Luciano didn't just create the Mafia. He created a mirror, one that still reflects the truth about power, ambition, and the human need to feel untouchable.